Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations in all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The words we heard from Mark's Gospel can seem very alien to us. And the section that we read is referred to by scholars as Mark's little apocalypse. Apocalyptic literature in our Bible can be very hard to understand. We find it in the book of Daniel, and of course the book of Revelation of John the Seer. Our minds are, my mind, flipped to images of the Left Behind series. Who remembers those books? Winged horsemen, vacant-eyed zombies lurching through deserted neighborhoods, and interplanetary war of cosmic proportions and nuclear war. Look at a weird imagination. My mind also thought about all those predictions of the end times. Nostradamus was famous for them. Do you remember Y2K, the millennium? And what about the Mayan calendar that was purported to predict the end of the world in 2012? So perhaps we are used to an apocalyptic worldview. More than we realise, even if we do find it rather odd and off-putting. What drives people then and now to try to peer into the future and predict or try to describe the future, the end of history? More often than not, the answer lies in the belief that the future not only sheds light on present problems, but also proves a measure of relief from them. And this is especially true in confusing and uncertain times. The world was very confusing when Mark was writing his Gospel. It's difficult for us to understand living through the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Second Temple, or living under the horrors of Herod, or Emperor Nero. And yet we too have some experience of living in uncertain and catastrophic times. Just last week, we remembered the wars. We remembered 100 years since the end of the First World War, the war to end all wars. We remember the Second World War. And of course, during that time, there was the Blitz, Kristallnacht, the Holocaust. We have witnessed planes being flown into the Twin Towers. There are acts of violence that defy the imagination almost on a daily basis. Mass shootings seem to be almost a norm in the US. We watch in horror the machinations of a president as he seems to bolster nationalistic worldviews, almost allowing the growth of racism in the States, a country that was built on the ideals of freedom and welcome. We watch in politics as there is a looming shift in power balances in our world, and it makes us feel unbalanced, as the West loses both its political and economic power base, and other nations with different views on justice and human rights, and the environment, such as China, Russia, India, and Brazil, grow in economic and political power. There is a real international political realignment underway. Global warming is real. We see floods and fires, tornadoes and hurricane winds more devastating than they have ever been in history before. So yes, perhaps we can understand the tumultuous world of the first century. And it can be so easy to read those things as signs of the end times. One thing that is common in all of these natural disasters and man-made wars is that those who care for the victims report that they all express a profound sense of loss. Not only have they lost loved ones and property, but they've lost a sense of security as well. Anyone who has lived through devastation such as those know that something that they once believed to be sure, for example, a towering structure or a temple with stone blocks 40 feet across, would stand forever, or that an ocean would always stay securely in its seabed and not traverse miles of dry land. Something that they always believed to be secure is no longer secure. When devastation like that happens, we lose the foundational belief that we have built our lives upon. No longer can you step on land and wonder, will it shift? Or look at a darkening sky and wonder what destructive storm is heading. William Butler Yeats wrote a poem in the 1920s called The Second Coming. And many believe that that little apocalyptic scripture from Mark speaks of the second coming. Yeats wrote, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned." So I guess the question is, and the question I have, is what was happening when Jesus and his disciples left the temple and sat at the Mount of Olives looking at this incredible building. A building that had stone blocks 40 cubics across. A building that was supposed to have had so much gold on the outside that when it caught the sun, it would cause a man to become blind. Jesus' words must have been troubling to hear that the structure would be destroyed. Harder to imagine. Jesus, I think, is pointing to the future where things might get harder after all. He will soon enter Jerusalem. Things will certainly get harder there. His followers will be persecuted. Mark, or the person that wrote the Gospel, is living in a time of persecution. As Mark writes, the temple has been destroyed. That which seemed impossible has become possible. The world is in upheaval. Perhaps some of Mark's community are leaving to listen to others, follow other messiahs. I don't believe that this passage was appointed to give us concrete hints about Jesus' return at the end of the world. I don't believe there's a timeline for those things either. I think it's an attempt to frame or interpret some of the challenges that Jesus' followers were facing, and some of the challenges in Mark's community. And in Mark's community there may have been dismay at Jesus' delayed return. After all, they expected his second coming to be imminent. The huge social and political upheaval caused by the destruction of the Second Temple was horrendous. Life was a mess for many of Mark's community. And he employs the symbols and metaphors of apocalyptic traditions about Jesus that he inherits to place the struggles and questions of his people in a cosmic context, and in this way offers a measure of both perspective and, believe it or not, comfort. You may not have found much in the way of comfort in those words. But I think it's an invitation for us to look at these scriptures in a comforting way. We too live in a chaotic world. There are many things that lure us away from faith. Many things. And in this instance, I'm using faith not as a system of beliefs, but as a life of action, faith as a verb. not an am. Not as a bunch of things that you need to tick off, but as a way of living life. All of us are disciples of Christ who follow in his way. All of us are folks who try to emulate his life, a life of loving acceptance, caring and sharing God's love with everyone he met, the unlovable and the unlikable. And while we can get caught up in the signs of the times, and perhaps lured away by trying to find things, money perhaps, power or prestige, things that will allow us to feel stable in our lives, the lure of wealth or possessions, these are perpetual contenders for our allegiance in a consumerist society. A society and economy oriented to unending consumption. What else could it be that attracts us or lures us? Perhaps it's the possibility of a more prestigious position at work, or acceptance by an appealing school or social group. Perhaps it's the dream of a perfect relationship, or just being in a relationship with someone who values you and cares for you. Or maybe it's the smaller attractions of being super competent and hopefully for being noticed for that. You know, the best minister in the world, the ideal friend, sibling, child, again with due attention to our achievement. Or maybe we find ourselves worshipping at the altar of providing our children with everything we never had, but want to make sure that they enjoy, with an emphasis on making sure. Or maybe, well, I'm sure you get the idea. But here's the interesting thing about all these various claimants of our attention and allegiance that they all have in common. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of them, right? There's nothing wrong wanting your kids to have more than you had. There's nothing wrong with wanting to get into the best school, to have a great relationship. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be a great minister. There's nothing wrong with any of that. In fact, it could be said that there's much to be admired about things like that. Much good that can be achieved through these various desires. Yet none of them can replace God in our lives. None of them can bear the weight of meaning that we unconsciously ask them to, and for which we so desperately long. And yet we are either so insecure or confused, and right now you're maybe a little bit of both, that like Mark's community, we so crave a level of certainty that we take these God-given gifts and turn them into God. And perhaps that is the human condition. Worshipping the gifts of God rather than God, the giver. And maybe that's a little bit about what that very tricky little passage is about. In times of confusion and challenge and distress, we will not only be overtly impressed by the symbols of power around us. Teacher, look how big those stones are. But we will also take many of the delights and gifts of those life and seek to find our security in and through them, rather than the one who gave them to us in the first place. Security in our relationships with one another, in money, in jobs, in being better at, the best at, instead of investing in our relationship with God. Living with uncertainty was hard for the first century followers of Jesus. And it's just as hard for his 21st century disciples as well. The promise God offers us in Christ, however, is not that if we work just hard enough or are pious enough or make ourselves acceptable enough or attain enough, that we'll leave all our uncertainties and insecurities behind. Because those of us who work really hard and try to attain, when you take a minute to stop and listen, the uncertainty and the insecurity is all still there. But if we leave those things behind, we are promised that we can discover who we are. And we can only do that in relation to whose we are, to who we belong to, as we receive our identity as beloved children of the God who created and sustains all things and loves every single one of us unconditionally. The antidote to uncertainty, it turns out, isn't certainty, but courage. And the best response to insecurity is the confidence that comes from knowing that God esteems you, all of you, worthy of dignity, honour, and love. Rooted in these promises, we are better equipped to resist all pretenders to the throne of our hearts and our lives, and give our allegiance to the one who gave all things for us. Thanks be to God. Amen.